Welcome back to First Down South, everybody. We made it through another week of college football, and I am here to break down everything we saw in the SEC and everything we're going to see in the week to come with two of the best reporters covering the SEC today. That would be John Talty on my right there and Matt Zenitz on the bottom of your screen. Fellas, we had sort of a rivalry week this week in the SEC. It's not quite the same, obviously, but some of the league's sort of premier in-conference rivalries were played this week, with the Iron Bowl and the Egg Bowl in particular. And even though it's not the end of the season, like it would normally be after this week, I do feel like we learned a lot, and I feel like there were some things that solidified and were resolved by some of the games that we saw. And in particular, I think the most of the nation was focused on the Iron Bowl. You're always going to be paying closer attention when the number one team is playing in a rivalry game. And this one really never felt competitive. I think that is probably boring for the average viewer. I'm sure that most Alabama fans were happy that it was boring. But you know, what was sort of your biggest takeaway for the two of you after watching Alabama's sort of demolition of Auburn in this game? And we'll start with you, John.
Don't call Mac a game manager. That's what I learned. I think that was one of the big storylines. And, I think Bo Nix learned his lesson on that one. I mean, I think some of the big takeaways are, Mac Jones deserves to be a Heisman candidate, a serious candidate. He's already been in the mix, but I think he should be one of the top two or three. I think you can make an argument that Devonta Smith should be considered a Heisman candidate too. Has had a great year in general, but I think just since Jalen Waddle's gone down, Smith has really stepped it up and emerged as one of if not the nation's top wide receivers. And then I think just looking at the performance Steve Sarkisian had, this is a guy who had an opportunity last year to not get the Mississippi State job. He was one of the top two or three candidates for it. Decided to come back to Alabama, and I think just showed with the offensive call and just managing the game in general. Why so many schools, whether it's this year or in the future, are going to be interested in possibly giving Sark another shot as a head coach.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that part of this specifically, Matt, because that was sort of the undercurrent of the game was, Nick Saban wasn't there. He was watching the game from home. He was not able to coach on game day. But you never really would have known from watching Alabama play. I'm curious, Matt, how you feel like that part of this. What is the takeaway from that part of this equation? Are we supposed to come away from this saying maybe Alabama doesn't need Nick Saban anymore? Or are we supposed to come away from this saying Alabama's program is so strong that maybe they can withstand a transition going forward?
I think the bigger part of that is just that Sark's stock was already at a really good point going into this season, and he's continued to build on that throughout the course of the year, including with that game. So even without Nick Saban on the sideline for an Iron Bowl for the first time since 2006, Alabama comes away with one of the more lopsided wins in an Iron Bowl in recent history, winning by 29 points. But some of the big takeaways for me are along the same lines as what John talked about. So obviously it was impressive with Sark, the way he was able to step in and get Alabama through that game pretty seamlessly without Nick Saban being in there, whereas with most teams, that would probably be more of an issue in terms of getting through the game. I think Devonta Smith, along the lines of what John was talking about, is probably more deserving at this point of being included in the Heisman conversation than what it seems like he is right now. You could make a very good argument that he's arguably the most valuable player on Alabama's team right now, and the way that he has stepped up. Obviously, he was important and productive even before Jalen Waddle got hurt, but has taken his game to an even greater level since Jalen Waddle went down. And actually, at this point, if Alabama ends up playing 13 games, which obviously looks like there's a good chance of that happening at this point based on how they look, that Devonta Smith is currently on pace to post some ridiculous numbers. So as it stands right now, it's on pace to finish, if they play 13 games, with something along the lines of 117 catches, more than 1,700 yards and 20 touchdowns, which is just ridiculous in terms of total numbers, and just has been a tremendous player for Alabama to the point that not only is he arguably the top receiver in the country, but you can make a great point that he's been one of the top overall players in the country to go along with that. And then the last thing I'll throw out there, the defense, which has gotten overshadowed for Alabama just based on what this offense continues to do. It continues to play really well. So obviously had a tough start to the year, specifically with the combination of that game against Ole Miss and the first half against Georgia, where they allowed during a 6-quarter span 72 points. But since then, in the 18 quarters and 4.5 games since then, have only allowed 33 points total. And obviously against Auburn, it was on the verge of holding them without a touchdown until a late meaningless touchdown from Bo Nix. So it makes Alabama even more dangerous moving forward, just the way that the defense has improved throughout the course of the year.
I do want to go back to Sark and his stock right now, because obviously this was we still don't know if this game is actually going to go down in the record books as a head coaching win for Steve Sarkisian. It seems like it's a little bit complicated.
For Coach Saban.
Yeah.
Based on the fact that the Georgia game, if he had missed it, Coach Saban would have gotten either the winner or loss for that game. So I would assume it would be the same kind of situation with this one.
But that said, look, this was a situation where it was a pretty big game. Sark was the guy out there running the sideline for Alabama. It was a very successful offensive game for Alabama. And really, for the last couple of seasons, Sark's offensive play calling has made him one of the most desired coaches in the country. John, you're pretty tapped in on the coaching side of things and in the coaching market. When we talk about how hot of a candidate Sark is right now, I think some of that does depend on the jobs that are available right now, right? So sure. What's the landscape looking like to you right now? And if you're Steve Sarkisian, is there a job or two that maybe you're waiting to see come open before you start to have serious conversations about it?
I don't know if there's a job or two you're waiting to come open, but I think you're certainly waiting to see what other jobs do come open. Because I think right now, if you look at what's generally open, you've got South Carolina and Vanderbilt in the SEC, you've got Southern Miss. There's really no, I think, elite level job. Sorry, Laura Goldman, if you're listening to this, South Carolina is not an elite job. And so, I don't think Sark has been that interested in that job from what I've heard. So, I think for him, he has put himself in a situation where, he's already been a head coach at a major level. So I think there's a known quantity there. Everyone knows about his, well-documented personal issues, which, any school is going to want to do their due diligence on to make sure that, he's fully passed, or as best as he can be past those issues. But, I think that he's in line for a Power 5 job. It's just waiting to see which ones are going to come open. I think everyone's kind of curious as to, whether you have a Texas or Michigan or something like that opens up. Sark probably wouldn't get in the mix for those jobs, but that could then kind of create a domino effect in which maybe some other good jobs do open up. So I don't think Sark leaves this year, in part just because I don't think there's a great job that's going to open up. But, if one of those big jobs open up, either through a firing or, if a Matt Campbell, Lincoln Riley type goes to the NFL, maybe that creates some other jobs opening up that Sark would be interested in. But I think he certainly has set himself up to be a major candidate for, a better job once one opens up.
Well, I'm sure Alabama fans will be happy to hear that you don't think Sark is necessarily leaving this year. That'd be a good situation for them. But also, it's really not a bad situation that he's in right now. He's getting paid a ton of money by Alabama with that new contract. He's getting to coach a group of talent that makes him, frankly, look really good. And I'm sure he is doing a great job, but easy to look pretty good with the kind of talent that he's coaching out there right now on offense. And on top of it, none of the head coaching pressure that comes along with that. So not a bad situation to be in. I am curious, though. Again, this was like our first sort of taste of maybe what it could feel like to watch Alabama football without Nick Saban. It didn't last very long because he was on TV with CBS as soon as the game ended, talking about, essentially functioning as the head coach doing the post-game media hit. But that said, we saw the team come out onto the field with a different coach that wasn't Nick Saban. It was a taste of what post-Saban life could be like at Alabama. And Matt, I'm curious how much you think somebody like Sark or perhaps a different assistant under Saban could be looked at as the next guy once that day finally comes that Nick Saban decides to retire.
Sark is one of the natural people to look at right now, and that's something that's been brought up by multiple people in the coaching role, including some with connections to Alabama. Then obviously we speculated for so long about who the heir apparent could be whenever Nick Saban ultimately decides to move on, whenever that is. And one of the guys that the people in the coaching world are definitely talking about right now as somebody that would make sense as an option is Sark, based on the work that he's continued to do during the course of this now 2-year run at Alabama as offensive coordinator. But just to piggyback on what John was talking about in terms of jobs for him and the market and all of that, the feeling among people in the coaching world is that he is in position where he can be very selective, be very picky. He's making $2.5 million a year. And the sense is that it would take something significant for him to even consider leaving his current position to go for. So some of the jobs that could potentially come open, like a Michigan, I do think that would be interest. I don't know where he would rank on their list of candidates, but it would take a job like that, I think, for it to even be a consideration based on the sense that I have at this point. And I would agree with John that it's probably looking more likely than not at this point that he would be back at Alabama as offensive coordinator compared to him leaving and taking a head coaching job, just based on what's available right now and based on what it looks like could come open.
Is the head coach in waiting concept totally dead? Is that experiment over? Do we don't think programs?
When has it ever worked?
It never has.
I mean, I can think of Maryland had James Franklin as their head coach in waiting. He left before that happened. Texas had Will Muschamp as their head coach in waiting. He left for Florida before that happened. I can't really think of many times where there's been like a successful passing of the baton.
Wasn't Jimbo technically head coach in waiting at Florida State?
I think he was, and that was, as everyone remembers, got kind of ugly, and with Bobby Bowden got pushed out because I think Jimbo was sick of waiting. So I mean, it almost never works. And here's the interesting thing, and I know that Matt has good sources, so I don't doubt what people are saying about Sark. But, I mean, Scalise, you might be able to better answer this one. Like, in terms of Alabama fans, I just have the feeling that I get is that they would want Sark to go out and be a head coach again and then come back rather than sliding over from an assistant position just because of how great that job is, that they think they should be able to get anybody. That it's just hard for me to imagine an assistant sliding over versus, like, sending Sark back out into the world and then him having success and then them bringing him back home.
Yeah, I definitely think that Alabama fans are going to have extremely high expectations once that moment comes. But I think the people who are involved in making the decision are going to heavily consider the concept that, look, what Saban has going, he's a great coach. He is a man who brought many ideas to the table and makes many great choices on his own. But he also created a process. He created a system that almost ensures that it's going to have repeated success if the system is followed. So I could see there being really strong temptation to say, whatever we do, it would behoove us to try to keep the same infrastructure in place if it's possible, rather than saying, let's bring in a new guy, throw everything out and let the new guy do it however he wants to do it. I feel like it would be very tempting to instead hire somebody who makes the pitch by saying, look, I worked for Coach Saban for a really long time. I know how he likes to do things. And my plan is, let's just keep that going. I think there would be a lot of appeal to Alabama to hear a pitch like that. And I think so somebody who has worked under him for a substantial amount of time could bring that to the table, whether it's Sark, whether it's maybe Lane. I would say Jeremy Pruitt has really only hurt his contention for that position by going off to become a head coach somewhere, because frankly, he stepped into a job where it probably was going to be really tough for him to succeed. So that's the downside of going off and taking a head coaching job somewhere else is, it might not go that well. You might hurt your candidacy.
The thing that I would add in about Sark also is it's not like they're making this decision right now. It's not like Nick Saban is expected to retire coming out of this year. So if it does work out where Sark is at Alabama moving forward as the offensive coordinator, you would think that he would put himself in position where we would continue to improve his standing for that kind of opportunity, just based on what it looks like this offense could accomplish moving forward. So even if you lose Mac Jones coming out of this year to go along with guys like Najee Harris and Devontae Smith and all of them, you have a very, very talented young quarterback to go along with some other talented young pieces offensively that you would assume that they will continue to be very successful from an offensive standpoint. To go along with that, he is highly, highly thought of behind the scenes there, not only from a peer standpoint, but even in terms of administration. And that obviously will factor into things whenever it does come time for them to make a decision as far as the successor. The big question with that, just when's that actually going to be a position that they get put in? And once again, we're not expecting that at any point necessarily in the near future.
No, and in fact, to reference something that one of our colleagues in the industry wrote about this week, Chris Lowe from ESPN seemed to be suggesting that, if anything, Nick Saban watching this game on TV sort of gave him an even stronger feeling that he doesn't want to retire anytime soon. So I, look, things can change quickly, but it doesn't seem like Nick Saban is attempting to wrap his career up at the moment.
And I mean, I will say, no one in our industry has a closer relationship with Nick Saban than Chris Lowe. So I would say that that's an informed opinion on his behalf. I think it's one of those things that, I think Zenitz kind of hit on this earlier, that it's just something that we're always going to talk about. It's a fun topic to talk about, but I don't think it's impossible to know right now when he's going to leave, and it's impossible to know who the top candidates are going to be because we don't know when he's going to leave. If he leaves in a year, I think we can figure out who the top candidates are. If he leaves in 8-9 years, like Chris was suggesting, who knows who's even going to be coaching at that point, And so that's what makes, I think, part of this topic always challenging. It's just so much can change between now and then. But, I think I would probably split the difference if I was guessing maybe 4 or 5 more years. But, he's still healthy. And I think Nick is, as long as Nick knows he can coach at a high level, he's going to want to keep doing it. I think if he gets to a point where he doesn't think he can impact the way he used to, that's when he's going to walk away.
Well, obviously everything is relatively riding high for Alabama right now. There's an opposite side to the Iron Bowl, obviously, and that is the Auburn Tigers, who came away with a really tough to swallow loss. You never want to lose your big rivalry game, but I think this was a particularly tough one for Auburn, just given the sort of dominating nature of it. They really never felt like they were in this game. And I think that's the bigger disappointing part for Auburn fans, rather than just, look, you're not gonna beat Alabama every year. And I think most realistic Auburn fans know that. But I think there was, I out there on the internet saw a lot of frustration with some of the play calling decisions in this game. In particular, Gus opting to kick 3 field goals in this game, including one really long field goal that was ultimately missed at a point in the game where they were 3 touchdowns behind. It seemed, look, coaches have their sort of guidebooks that they follow of when you do what in different situations. But there was a perception, I think, among some fans that the effort wasn't there, the desire wasn't there. They didn't seem to be they didn't seem to have their heart in this one. How much of that is just fans being fans, and I think how much of that is this Auburn team is not in a good place emotionally, mentally right now.
I guess what I would say is something that I think I've said on here in the past is that, I think with how the fan base views Gus, he's just never going to get the benefit of the doubt. And so, I think I've said this on here too. Saban is the exact opposite. Saban can basically do no wrong with the Alabama fan base. Saban can try to convince you that the sky is green, and you'd at least have people defending that take. Gus, anytime he makes a mistake or what is perceived as a mistake, the fan base is going to jump on him. And so I think there are real questions about where this Auburn program is headed. If you look back a year ago, Auburn wins the Iron Bowl, has some momentum, knocks Alabama out of the playoff race. You got a young quarterback in Bo Nix. Felt like, all right, he maybe is peaking a little bit. A lot of excitement kind of heading into bowl season. I think that excitement is gone right now. I think that it's a weird year, so I think you can kind of give some excuses to everybody because of that. But certainly, I think we haven't seen the development around Bo Nix that you would have hoped for. I don't think Chad Morris is the most popular hire right now in Auburn, and so I think that some of the fan complaints I saw are a bit overstated, but I do think there's, concern to some extent around where the program is headed. And again, to wrap it up, I think that, Gus is just not a beloved character. And so whenever things start to go wrong, you will start to see people trying to, bring up the negatives and try to force them out.
Matt, I want to talk about a couple of sort of personnel related aspects to Auburn's loss to Alabama in this game. Obviously, they were missing some key players and had some guys banged up on the offensive line. And it seems like that's been kind of a recurring issue for Gus, especially in recent years. You're a guy for us that follows player development, knows a lot about recruiting. It's interesting to me and difficult that a coach that is, again, an offensive guru, one, and two, who's, traditionally the offense that he wrote the book on literally is very predicated on having a strong running game. But Gus doesn't seem to have had the kind of consistent success on the offensive line that you would expect somebody with that style of offense to have. I'm curious on your perspective on that side of it, the offensive line personnel issues at Auburn.
Well, they obviously lost some key players from last year's offensive line, but the bigger problem for Gus and Chad Morris this year has been the lack of progression, the lack of development from Bo Nix. So when you've looked at Bo against better teams, or specifically the 3 games that they've lost, in those 3 games, Bo has all of 1 total touchdown pass to go along with 6 interceptions. And obviously against Alabama, didn't throw any touchdowns, had a couple interceptions, just didn't look great during the course of that game. And considering the reputation in terms of, from an offensive mind standpoint, that Gus, Chad Morris have, and the optimism that they shared leading up to the season, just expected more in terms of development and play from Bo Nix specifically than what we've seen throughout the course of the year. In terms of Gus, specifically in his standing at Auburn, there definitely started to be chatter with some of those behind-the-scenes power players after they started 2-2 and after they lost to a South Carolina team that's turned out to be bad enough that ended up firing their head coach and the worst team in the conference right now, probably aside from Vanderbilt. And like we've talked about on this show before, this is an Auburn team that, while they're 5-3 at this point, could easily be 3-5 if not for some pretty bad officiating blunders, and that does not get forgotten, regardless of what the record is on paper at this point, with some of those people behind the scenes, especially when you combine it with the fact that the guy that you're leaning on most from a player standpoint to lead you to better things moving forward, and Bo Nix, just hasn't taken the kind of step forward that I'm sure they were hoping for this year. So that talk with Gus had died down some as they went on a little winning streak after starting 2-2. But they end this year, obviously coming off of a loss to Alabama that dropped them to 5-3, with a game against Texas A&M that obviously they're an underdog going into. And then, like we've talked about behind the scenes, end the year with a game against Mississippi State that all of a sudden looks like, I'm not going to say that Auburn isn't going to be favored in that game, but it looks like a potentially losable game just based on how Mississippi State has played these last couple of weeks, including how they've come along offensively to the point that their freshman quarterback threw for like 440 or whatever in this last game against Ole Miss.
Well, certainly Ole Miss's our defense has made a lot of quarterbacks look pretty good, but yes.
But he also threw like 330 against Georgia.
He did, yeah. I mean,
overall, they've taken a noticeable step forward. And in each of these last 2 games, even though they've lost, those 2 games have both been decided by only 7 points, including against a top 10 team in Georgia.
And they had a shot to win both games pretty late into the game. So not a particularly comforting scenario ahead. John, I I keep commenting about how weird it is that the Iron Bowl has happened, and yet there's still kind of a decent chunk of season left. We're not sort of directly, the teams that have had disappointing years don't get to just slump off after losing their rivalry game and recover themselves a little bit before a bowl game. You've got to go back out there and keep yourself together, or things could really end on a sour note for the program. I think in the case of Alabama right now, it's ended up looking like their last two opponents are probably two of the easier ones on their entire schedule for the season. But for Auburn, that might not be the case. They now have to go play a top 5 Texas A&M team, who granted didn't look spectacular last weekend, but they're a top 5 team for a reason. They've only lost to Alabama, and I'm curious how you feel Gus's. We've done this game with Gus over and over again. He gets to the precipice of making everybody mad enough to fire him, and then he wins a big one that people maybe aren't expecting him to win. Talk to me about kind of the two ways that the rest of this season could go for Auburn, and genuinely, what is the range of end game scenarios that Gus could have at this season?
I mean, I think the general assumption and feeling is that Gus will be back next year. I think I think if you look at the most likely outcome, that's the most likely outcome. I think if they beat Texas A&M this weekend, that pretty much guarantees that's the outcome. I think if they, lose to Texas A&M and beat Mississippi State, which is probably the most likely of all the outcomes, then I think, again, Gus comes back next year. Now, if Auburn gets blown out against Texas A&M and then loses to Mississippi State to end the year, having got blown out by Alabama, you get blown out by Texas A&M, then you lose to Mississippi State. I think that's when it gets interesting, because I think that's when you're going to see some boosters get very antsy and really question, the future of the program. Now, I think at Auburn, one of the things to consider is that, AD Allen Green seems to be, someone who's, pretty reliable, pretty consistent, isn't, kind of prone to massive swings one way or another. But you'd have to wonder whether, some of the important money people at Auburn really kind of push his hands a little bit to make a move. So, again, I think your most likely scenario is that Gus is back next year, maybe make some staff changes. He's done that in the past. But, again, I think if they lose out and it looks ugly, that's when it gets a little interesting.
Yeah, and I feel like I should mention, too, one weird aspect that we haven't really talked very much about is the fact that the end of this season is sort of lining up very, very closely with early signing day, which is now the new normal. This is now like basically the main signing day in college football. This is when you have to have your guys locked in basically by mid-early December. And, I think I've seen some people cite that as the reason why South Carolina and Vanderbilt went ahead and pulled the trigger on firing their head coaches early in the season. Some of it's to get out ahead in the coaching sweepstakes, but some of it is because you don't want your recruiting to get away from you. And right now, Auburn's in a little bit of a dangerous spot. I'm looking at the 24/7 rankings right now for recruiting. Auburn is currently, after a string of some fairly high-profile decommitments, including the best running back in the state of Alabama, they're now 39th nationally. Which, look, we know they're gonna finish stronger than that. But it's not a good spot to be in this close to signing day. Closing out a season looking like the program is on a decline could really tank your recruiting momentum. And I think more than anything else, and look, boosters are not always rational thinkers. They don't always act based on strategy. But I think if I was somebody who felt an investment in the college football program personally, as a booster, and that's how boosters think most of the time. They feel like they're personally invested in the program. And I see not only are we having a rough season, but the recruiting is taking a dive. That to me is the most disturbing part about the future of the program and what would potentially push me to want to make a change.
Yeah, it hasn't been a good last week for Gus. So you combine the Alabama loss with potentially a loss to Alabama in recruiting. So Armani Goodwin decommits, and from what I've heard from people in the coaching world, it seems like Alabama is one of the main schools to keep an eye on for him. So it makes it worse from an Auburn standpoint that not only do you lose the top-ranked players within your recruiting class, but potentially end up losing him to your top rival.
So I'll tell you this, Matt. I got this text from an Auburn friend, and I'll read it here quick. Said that, mentioned the Sharif Cooper in the last week. Sharif Cooper news: postseason ban, smoked by Alabama, smoked by Gonzaga, bad performance against Central Florida, lost our running back commit, lost offensive tackle to Notre Dame. They feel like Gus is probably here to stay, and now the recruiting class is 39th and plummeting. So Auburn fans, I think, are already kind of upset about how the last couple of weeks have been.
Big our pets' heads are falling off energy from that text.
Very much so. And it was, what a week, baby, is how he closed it.
Yeah.
But it's I think they're certainly aware of how things are not going great right now for Auburn athletics. And so I think that energy is going to keep building if they keep losing. The basketball season, unfortunately for Gus, the basketball season doesn't provide a distraction the way it has in the last couple of years, And so there's going to be a lot of energy focused on the end of this Auburn season, especially because it is coming right up on the signing day. And so, again, you lose those last two games and you don't have a good day to start early signing day. You have some boosters who are very upset.
Yeah, and there's very few of those things on that long list that you mentioned that can actually be fixed or acted upon in any way. But you can fix who the head football coach is if you feel like I got to do something. I got all this money burning a hole in my bank account, and I want to do something with it to make Auburn sports better. That's one of the only things you can do is make a coaching change. So I don't know. We'll see how things wrap up for Gus as we go through the final stretch of the football season here. But guys, there are programs that are having a worse time in the SEC than Auburn right now, arguably. And one of them is LSU. They're getting ready to finally play Alabama after that game was delayed a few weeks ago. And it's not coming at a good time. It's certainly not putting LSU in a better position to be competitive in this game than they would have been a few weeks ago. On top of everything else that has happened to them this season, they're now down to, I guess, who we would say is the third string quarterback that they had on the field by the end of the Texas A&M game. I don't know if they're going to go back to Finley for this game. It's unclear to me what their quarterback situation is. But Ed Orgeron's obviously very frustrated with their quarterback situation. And on top of it, Terrace Marshall, their leading receiver for the season, has opted out for the remainder of the year. So you lose one of your best offensive weapons from an offense that has not had many weapons and hasn't had much good going for it this year. I bring this up in part, not because I want to talk about the Alabama-LSU game. I expect that to be a remarkably boring game. Alabama is almost a 30-point favorite at this point heading into the weekend. But for LSU, we're now seeing, they're probably the prime example in the country of lots of players opting out this season. But it started to cascade as the year goes on. And I think we've seen that. You guys mentioned Mississippi State's had that issue as well. And other programs around the country, it seems like once they reach a point where it's clear that they're not going to play for anything significant this season, where it's clear that their program is not going to have a good season, guys are opting out. How much worse could that problem get around the SEC and maybe just in general in college football? And could it even get to the point where you guys see a team shutting down for the rest of the season just because they don't have the personnel they need to be competitive in one of these last two games? I'll start with you, Matt.
I don't think it'll reach that point where a team will have to shut down, but I think this is a trend that's going to continue moving forward, even when we're out of this crazy COVID year, similar to how the Christian McCaffreys of the world started a trend in terms of players opting out for bowl games. So obviously this season specifically, we continue to see players opt out and just start early in terms of their prep for the draft. Even Kelvin Joseph, the corner at Kentucky, who's currently leading the SEC in interceptions. But with LSU, the funny part with them is, which has been the big issue for them throughout the course of the season, or most of the season, it's been the defense, Bo Pelini's defense. And the interesting part these last couple of games is the defense has actually gotten better, to where against Texas A&M only allowed 13 points on defense. They've gotten better on that side of the ball. And who knows, maybe the year combining the improvement from a defensive standpoint with what they were doing early in the year offensively, maybe it would be going differently if Miles Brennan hadn't have gotten hurt. But the offense just is not at a good point right now. So the freshman quarterback who started this past game ended up getting pulled in TJ Finley. He was all of 9 of 25 with a couple interceptions, including a pick 6 against A&M, just not playing great, to the point that it looks like they may go a different direction this week at quarterback with another true freshman, Max Johnson. But it isn't even just the quarterback position. The running game wise, and granted it was against a very good A&M defense, but their top running back against A&M had all of 18 yards on 11 carries. They're just not at a good point offensively, and it's part of the reason that I just don't see this game against Alabama being competitive, even factoring in that they have taken a step forward defensively and playing better on that side of the ball compared to how they were playing early in the year.
John, what do you think about that as a future dynamic that carries over after 2020, that we could potentially see guys who have high draft potential maybe deciding once they get to, mid-November in a normal year, hey, maybe I don't need to hang around and be a part of a team that doesn't seem as into this as I am, and I could instead just go off and start getting ready for the draft.
Yeah, I certainly think it's something that bears watching going forward. I think with this year, the one thing that I'm interested in, I think I mentioned it on one of the previous shows, but, I talked to some different people around the SEC who basically said, we have to drag some of these teams across the finish line. We're going to. And so I think that we'll get across the finish line. But the question I have is that whether you might see some teams turn down bowl invites because they just don't have enough players who want to play in that bowl. I think that's one of the challenges that is on the horizon. You head into 2021, and I think it's always going to be a concern, in terms of making sure your guys are bought in during a challenging year. I think that's always going to be a thing. I do think this year is unique in that because there's additional potential health concerns associated with it, it makes it much easier for guys to make that decision to opt out. I think in a normal year, there's a lot more stigma that comes with it. And I think there'd be some concerns, and I'm sure Zenitz can hit on this better than I can, but some concerns about how it might impact their draft stock if they just quit in the middle of a season. I think that you might get some of the dreaded character concerns or something like that. So I think that will stem it from becoming a massive thing. But certainly I wouldn't be shocked if next year a couple players decide at some point during the season to opt out because they just feel like the team's not doing anything and they can just better prepare for the draft on their own.
Yeah, definitely a strange time in college football, but I do wonder what the overall impact will be on the future from this season. I think there will be at least some elements of this season that we look back on and say, it was probably going to happen eventually anyway, and 2020 just sort of sped up the process when it came to this one specific element of the sport. Well, guys, I think we'll wrap it up here for this week. There's definitely going to be, regardless of how competitive this weekend's games are, I think there's still a lot of interesting storylines that need to play out. As we've mentioned, the Heisman race today, I think it's starting to get really compelling. We're not hearing a ton of chatter about it yet, but I think it could be something that Alabama fans in particular get very invested into. We've got an upcoming SEC championship game that I think is going to be very interesting right now. I'm very curious to see how that one plays out. So we'll have plenty to talk about for the remaining. I mean, look, we've still got 3 weeks of season left. I know it doesn't feel like we should because we just had rivalry week, but we're really sort of in the thick of what would normally be a November for college football season. But here we are in December talking about it. So thanks for everybody for joining us on First Down South again, and you guys have a great week.